As the Roman Empire expanded and dominated vast territories, there was an enemy that challenged its understanding: the barbarians. With war traditions rooted in customs and tactics that differed radically from Roman discipline, these warriors were often seen as disorganized and primitive. However, this perception masked a profound strategic knowledge that challenged Roman assumptions. In this video, we will explore the war traditions of the barbarians and what the Romans truly failed to understand about their tactics, revealing how these differences shaped not only battles but also the fate of civilizations. The barbarians, as they were known to the Romans, viewed war in a way that was deeply rooted in their traditions and the struggle for survival. Unlike the Romans, who used war as an extension of their expansionist policies, barbarian peoples often saw it as a necessary path to maintain the honor of their tribe or secure vital resources. For many of these groups, battle was not just a military matter, but an integral part of their cultural identity. The barbarian warrior was viscerally connected to his land and people, fighting not for personal glory, but for the continuity of his lineage and traditions. As the Romans observed these peoples, they frequently underestimated their motivations. The Roman view of war was based on orders, discipline, and a rigid hierarchy. In contrast, while the barbarians were less structured from a Roman military perspective, they valued individual courage and tribal bonds as the central strength of their campaigns. This contrast in perspectives led the Romans to see the barbarians as disorganized and driven by chaos. However, what the Romans failed to understand was that this disorder represented a different kind of structure, where war reflected life itself, a cycle of challenges and resistance. The concept of honor also played a central role in barbarian war traditions. Many tribes required their warriors to prove their worth in combat to earn respect and status within the community. Death in battle, rather than being viewed as a failure, was considered the highest honor, securing the warrior a place alongside his ancestors. This code of honor compelled the barbarians to fight with a ferocity that the Romans often did not comprehend. For them, the enemy was willing to die without hesitation, which contradicted the practical logic of the Roman war machine, which aimed to preserve its soldiers for future battles. In addition to honor, physical survival was a constant motivation. Barbarian tribes faced constant threats, both from external enemies and internal rivals. War was a means to secure hunting territories, pastures for livestock, and fertile lands to sustain their communities. These conflicts shaped a mindset of resilience among the barbarians, which the Romans often interpreted as primitive brutality. Yet, what the Romans viewed as excessive violence was, in fact, an adaptive strategy to a hostile and unpredictable environment. Barbarian warfare was also deeply connected to spirituality. Warriors believed that their actions in combat were linked to the gods and the fate of their people. Rituals before battles, sacrifices, and invocations to ancestors were common, as success on the battlefield was thought to depend as much on the warrior's skill as on divine favor. This mystical aspect of war was completely foreign to the Romans, who tended to see war as a more pragmatic and technical science, relying on numbers, strategy, and military engineering. One of the biggest differences between the war tactics of the barbarians and the Romans was the use of mobility and surprise attacks. While Roman legions were known for their solid and slow formations, the barbarians preferred quick and devastating strikes, often catching the Romans off guard. Barbarian peoples, especially the Germanic and Celtic tribes, extensively utilized geography to their advantage, attacking in dense forests, mountains, and narrow valleys. These terrains limited the effectiveness of the Romans' cohesive formations, making them vulnerable to the swift and fragmented assaults of the barbarians. Guerrilla warfare was a tactic that the Romans, accustomed to organized field battles, did not immediately understand. For the barbarians, it made no sense to confront the Roman army in open fields, where their discipline and superior weaponry would give them the advantage. Instead, the barbarians favored ambushes and nighttime attacks, causing chaos among enemy ranks before disappearing back into familiar terrain. This style of combat deeply frustrated Roman commanders, who saw their overwhelming force rendered ineffective against constant evasion. The barbarians also effectively used light cavalry and rapid infantry, surprising the Romans on several occasions. Unlike the heavier Roman cavalry, which was slower and more organized, the barbarians relied on agility and terrain knowledge to attack and retreat quickly. The unpredictability of these attacks kept Roman armies on constant alert, undermining their morale and exhausting their resources in long pursuit campaigns. In battles where Roman numerical superiority should have prevailed, the barbarians' ability to destabilize their forces proved decisive. The flexibility of barbarian tactics stood in stark contrast to the rigidity of Roman command. The legions were trained to follow orders strictly, while barbarian leaders encouraged individual initiative and instant adaptation on the battlefield. This gave barbarian warriors an advantage when situations changed rapidly, allowing them to exploit weaknesses in the enemy without waiting for formal orders. To the Romans, this lack of clear hierarchy seemed a flaw, but in reality, it was an efficient way to respond to the chaotic dynamics of war. Another factor complicating the Roman understanding of barbarian tactics was the use of temporary alliances between tribes. Unlike the unified legions under a single banner, barbarian armies often consisted of various tribes with momentary loyalties. The Romans interpreted this as a lack of cohesion, not realizing that these fluid alliances allowed for greater strategic mobility. Tribes could disperse quickly and then regroup elsewhere, confusing the enemy and making it impossible to completely encircle or subdue these forces. While the Romans valued strict discipline and direct orders, the barbarians operated within a much more fluid and tribal structure. Each warrior was deeply connected to his tribe, and it was this bond that fueled their strength on the battlefield. For the barbarians, loyalty to the tribe was paramount, and this unity allowed them to mobilize quickly without relying on centralized orders. When multiple tribes united in alliances, especially against a common enemy like Rome, this tribal cohesion transformed into a powerful and unpredictable force. The Romans, observing these tribal armies, saw the lack of a centralized command as a sign of weakness. However, this decentralization allowed for strategic flexibility that the Roman legions did not possess. Each tribal group acted independently, but with a common goal, making the barbarians less predictable in battle. Rather than following a single uniform strategy, they could adapt their tactics based on the situation, surprising the Romans with their ability to reconfigure during a fight. Barbarian alliances were also characterized by a deep sense of honor and reciprocity. Tribes that came together to fight expected loyalty and mutual support. This bond between tribes was often sealed by marriages or gift exchanges, further strengthening the sense of duty among the warriors. Although these alliances were frequently temporary, they could prove incredibly effective. When the common enemy disappeared, tribes might revert to their internal rivalries, but while they lasted, these coalitions posed a formidable threat even to the Roman army. This collective strength of the barbarians was rooted in a war mentality that valued the whole over the individual. While personal courage was essential, the survival and success of the tribe were always the priority. The death of a barbarian warrior was seen as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the tribe, and this mindset allowed the barbarians to fight with an intensity that the Romans often underestimated. The cohesion within a tribe, united by bonds of blood and culture, created a combat force with unwavering unity. Additionally, the oral tradition among barbarian tribes played an important role in preserving and transmitting their war strategies and tactics. Stories of great battles and heroic deeds were passed down from generation to generation, shaping the character of the warriors. Each new warrior was imbued with a sense of historical continuity, knowing that their actions on the battlefield would contribute to the legacy of their tribe. This sense of collectivity and belonging to an ancestral lineage provided the barbarians with an even deeper motivation to fight with such determination. Among the barbarians, war was not just a physical act. It was also a spiritual event, filled with symbolic and religious meanings. Before any battle, many of these warriors performed rituals to ensure the favor of the gods and ancestral spirits. These rituals varied from tribe to tribe, but generally involved sacrifices, chants, and ceremonies aimed at aligning the warriors with supernatural forces. To the Romans, who viewed war as a military science, these rituals seemed incomprehensible and were often ridiculed as superstition. The symbolism behind these rituals reinforced the idea that barbarian warriors fought not just for themselves, but in the name of something much greater. They believed they were connected to a sacred history and a cosmic order, and that their actions on the battlefield would determine the fate not only of their tribe, but also of their place in the spiritual world. This belief gave the warriors unwavering confidence. As for them, death was not the end, but rather a transition to a new stage of existence alongside their ancestors and gods. The Romans, who were quite pragmatic in their military campaigns, often underestimated the psychological impact these rituals had on barbarian warriors. While the Romans placed their faith in tactics and formations, the barbarians entered combat with a strength renewed by their spiritual beliefs. This created the impression that they fought with uncontrollable fury when, in reality, what drove them was the certainty that they were acting in accordance with a divine destiny. For them, battle was both a physical and spiritual test, an opportunity to demonstrate their devotion and courage before the gods. Many barbarian tribes also had specific war symbols, such as totems and banners, which they carried into battle. These symbols were not mere decorations. They represented the spiritual essence of the tribe and the protection of the gods. The warriors fought with all their might to defend these sacred objects, believing that their loss would bring disgrace and destruction to their people. This attachment to sacred symbols created a dynamic where the battlefield became a space charged with spiritual and emotional power. Furthermore, the very act of waging war was seen as a direct connection to the divine. The barbarians believed that the gods' decisions could be influenced by their actions in combat, and that their bravery could change the course of predestined events. This link between the physical and spiritual worlds provided the barbarians with a sense of purpose that transcended military logic. Even in defeat, the barbarians felt that their courage and spiritual devotion gave them a moral advantage over their enemies, who, in their eyes, fought solely for power and material conquest. The Roman view of war was based on a rigid hierarchy and an extremely disciplined military structure. Each legion functioned like a well-oiled machine, with soldiers trained to follow orders precisely and fulfill specific roles on the battlefield. This efficiency was one of the main reasons for the success of the Roman Empire in its conquests. However, when the Romans encountered the barbarians, their organized and linear structures often clashed with the fluid and unconventional tactics of their tribal enemies. To the Romans, the barbarians appeared disorganized, almost chaotic in their assaults. Roman formations, accustomed to direct and controlled confrontations, were frequently disrupted by the unpredictability of the barbarians. What the Romans could not understand was that this apparent disorder concealed a tactical flexibility that gave the barbarians an advantage in complicated terrains and rapid combat dynamics. The lack of visible organization among the barbarians was, in fact, a different form of cohesion, where warriors moved as a fluid unit, each relying on their instincts and battle experience. This perception of disorganization was one reason why the Romans underestimated their opponents on several occasions. They expected the barbarians to behave in the same manner as the armies they had previously faced and defeated, such as the Greeks and Carthaginians. But the barbarians rarely fit that mold. Their tactic was not to win through rigorous discipline, but rather through surprise, rapid adaptation, and the exploitation of the enemy's momentary weaknesses. This combat style allowed the barbarians to compensate for their lack of numbers or sophisticated weaponry, something the Romans took a long time to comprehend. The inflexibility of the Roman legions also manifested in their dependence on heavy formations and open-field engagements, while the barbarians, with their superior mobility and intelligent use of terrain, could attack in less favorable locations for the large Roman masses. In dense forests or mountainous terrains, the Romans were often forced to abandon their traditional tactics, becoming vulnerable to barbarian ambushes. Instead of facing an enemy in the open field, they found themselves surrounded, disoriented, and attacked unexpectedly, with little time to react adequately. Furthermore, the Roman stubbornness in adhering to their military traditions, even in the face of an enemy that did not play by the same rules, often left them at a disadvantage. Their reluctance to adapt tactics to confront such a different style of combat resulted in defeats that, from a strategic standpoint, seemed avoidable. The belief that their way of waging war was superior prevented them from learning quickly from the barbarians, perpetuating misunderstandings and contributing to some of the most significant defeats of the Roman Empire, such as in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest.